There are two types of people, those who preach and those who act. But Phil Buchanan is one of a kind, and he somehow manages to do both. Born in Canada but raised in Oregon and living in Massachusetts, Buchanan worked as a strategist consultant to major companies, honoring his Harvard business diploma. To honor his soul and his calling, however, he took the challenge to lead the Center of Effective Philanthropy. For almost 20 years, Buchanan has been the protagonist of an organization that aims to analyze and explore efficient ways to solve big problems in our society. Part of his findings are immortalized in the book Giving Done and Right. It is a pleasure to talk to the man himself today. Welcome to Encontros Doar, Phil.
Thank you so much, Roberta. It's so good to be here. And that's a very overly kind introduction. I appreciate it.
Phil, you played roles on both sides. You have worked for companies and now you are part of a social organization. We often hear the argument that we should hire business people to lead NGOs, assuming that both institutions operate under the same logic, or that somehow the business sector could make the third sector more professional. What do you say for those who embrace this logic?
Yeah, I hear all the time people say nonprofits should operate more like business or like a business, and I never understand, like, what does that mean? Which business? Apple, Enron, the corner dry cleaner is not even a useful framing or phrase. And nonprofits are working on typically the challenges that have defied market solutions or government intervention. So they're the most stubborn, difficult to address issues. And there are many ways in which leadership of a nonprofit is different than leadership of a business. And, one example would just be with respect to strategy. In a business world, it's zero sum, competitive. What is Uber's market share relative to Lyft's? And for a nonprofit, strategy should be shared because usually one organization operating alone cannot achieve the goal. There's a need for coordination. So if you're a homeless shelter, you don't see the other homeless shelters as competitors. You see them as folks you need to coordinate with. And you probably see the drug treatment center also as a really important collaborator. And so it's just a very different dynamic. So strategy is different, performance measurement is different, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. And it's not that nothing translates. You can learn across the sectors in both directions, but you need to understand what is different about the nonprofit world.
Yes. And also, on the same note, there's this idea that investment and donations are the same thing. That when we give your money to charity or to philanthropy, you are investing in a cause. Do you think that is accurate?
Yeah, I don't like the investment analogy for a few reasons. One of the reasons relates to measurement, which I alluded to before, that there is no analog to return on investment, to ROI, right? Because if you're a donor, the way you judge the work that you do on climate change, is very different from the way you judge the work you do to improve education systems, right? The metrics are different, and you can't actually have a universal measure against which you could compare. I also don't like the analogy because investment implies ownership, right? And you don't own a nonprofit, so that's another thing. And I think investors are really focused on the growth of the particular company that they invest in. That's the be all end all. But that's not necessarily the right metric in philanthropy, because size isn't always the answer. Like sometimes it makes sense to scale organizations that are doing something effective across different geographies. But sometimes it makes sense to scale approaches that work, but to have the organizations be very community rooted and not to assume that folks in Sao Paulo want what folks in Rio want, right? But to rather have that connection and trust between the community and the organization. So small can be beautiful for nonprofits in a way that I think probably investors in the business world, wouldn't feel that way. So I just don't think it's a helpful analogy.
Yes. And talking about metrics, this is one of the biggest concerns we see both
Yeah.
between donors and among the nonprofit sector. How we can measure the success of an organization.
Yeah. And so here, I mean, so much of being effective as a donor or a nonprofit leader is about understanding nuance and the fact that there's no one size fits all answer, right? So when we look for one size fits all answers to measurement questions, we come up with things like overhead ratios. What percentage of the contribution goes to the cause? Because this is something that you can judge any organization by. But the problem is, it's actually not helpful or particularly meaningful, right? So if you're supporting a food pantry and you say, okay, but I only want my donation to support the potatoes and the carrots and the chicken, but not the staff who coordinate the volunteers needed to serve the food or the rent for the space where the work is done, this doesn't make any sense. All of those expenses are required in order to deliver food to hungry people. So we should avoid these kind of simplistic measures that are about budget allocations, because if you trust the leadership of an organization, you should trust them to allocate the money where they think it is going to do the most good relative to the mission, which as a donor, presumably, if you're giving to that organization, you believe in. So then the question becomes, well, how do you judge performance? And getting back to the point about nuance and context, it really just depends entirely what it is you're doing and how you're trying to do it. So in my book, Giving Done Right, I talk about different examples. There's an organization I write about that works on an issue called summer learning loss, which is basically like the academic backsliding that happens for young kids when they're not in school. And it happens for all kids, but it happens in a more pronounced way for lower income kids. So an organization here in the United States was trying to provide high quality academic programming to low income kids in the summer to counteract summer learning loss. Then the question was, well, how do we know if it's really working? And so they actually did very sophisticated evaluation, randomized control trials, to try to compare the kids who went through their program to a control group, just like you would with like a drug trial, right? A control group of kids who are sort of the same demographically, but didn't get access to the program. And they saw that the program was very effective. So they kept on working to scale it. That made sense for that organization. I write about another organization in the book that works with gang-involved young people in a few towns in Massachusetts near where I live. And they're trying to recruit these young people out of gangs, get them employed in a social enterprise that they run. They have a cafe and a woodworking shop that makes cutting boards, and they have a mattress recycling facility. And they help these young people turn their lives around, get on a different path. And this data is very good in terms of very low rates of recidivism. But they had donors who said, well, we'd like you to do a randomized control trial, like the other organization I mentioned. Well, this leader of that organization said, but we can reach every young person in our geography. So if we had a control group, we would be putting people's lives at risk, right? Because of gang violence. So no, we're not going to do that. That doesn't make sense for us. And then take a third example, the Children's Museum. Well, should they be looking at, whether folks' life trajectory is different, 10 or 15 years after they visited the Children's Museum? Well, of course not. Nobody expects that, right? That's not what the Children's Museum is offering. They're offering a fun educational experience, and probably they should assess their effectiveness with surveys of the people who came, how they felt about the experience. And there might be other measures that any organization should look at. But in terms of the impact metrics, they're going to vary depending on the goal and approach of the particular organization. That makes it hard, but all the more important to do well.
It's very good, Phil. And I know we are all overwhelmed about topics linked to the pandemic, but we can shy away from this relevant moment we are living. From your experience and observation through these 2 years, do you think this global crisis impacted either the number or the way donations are made and this kind of metrics you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should say, first of all, and my knowledge is pretty particular to the U.S. context, and so I want to be clear what I don't know. I don't
Sure.
know how much of what I'm going to say in response to your good question is more broadly true, but I can tell you what we saw here. And before I get to the question about donations, let me just say that I think nonprofits, and I know enough about other parts of the world to know that this is true globally. Many nonprofits were heroic during the pandemic, and their staff stepped up in all kinds of ways, putting themselves at risk because the need was so great. And one of the things that we saw nonprofits do all around the world is shift and pivot in an instant because they had to. So an organization that maybe worked with young people in one way, but didn't provide them food, all of a sudden realized we need to be providing them food because, there's no food because maybe they had a parent who worked in the hospitality business and that the job is suddenly gone, and we just saw incredible adaptiveness, resilience, flexibility on the part of nonprofits. And then in terms of donors, one really positive development that we saw here, at least, was a recognition that we have to give in a more flexible way. So that meant loosening restrictions on gifts, saying, we gave it to you for this program, but just use it for whatever makes sense now, because we realize, maybe we gave you a gift for an in-person program, but you can't deliver an in-person program in a pandemic. So unrestricting gifts, making new unrestricted gifts, streamlining processes to recognize in the middle of this crisis, the last thing we need is nonprofits stressing about some long report that they have to send to the funder. Instead, have a 10-minute conversation with me and tell me how it's going. Among foundations in the US, we also saw them step up their giving levels by 17, 18% year over year. So lots of really positive developments in terms of just donors recognizing that nonprofits needed a different kind of trust, flexibility, fewer restrictions. Another thing that we saw here in this country was donors recognizing the role of systemic racism and discrimination in a way that many had not previously. And of course, they should have, but
Yes,
the
we saw
important,
that here too.
yeah, but the important thing is that there's progress there, right? Like a recognition that it's not just coincidence that some people are, dying at a higher rate than others, or being infected at a higher rate, right? There's all kinds of systemic issues having to do with who's in what jobs and where people are in our society. And that led to some really positive work to take that on in a more direct way and to fund differently and to fund to organizations supporting particular communities and to organizations led by people from different communities, to realize, to the point I was making before, that smallness can be an asset, that giving to community rooted organizations that have the trust of the people they serve is a smart thing to do. So those are some of the things that we saw change. And I think now the big question is, are those changes in donor behavior going to be sustained? Because many of those changes are positive, I think, and in any time, and they don't need to be confined to a time of crisis, because actually most nonprofits are worthy of a higher level of trust than maybe we instinctively place in them.
Sure. And Phil, now talking about your book, the title says it all. Don't giving done right. Can you briefly explain to us what actually is the correct way to donate that you explore so beautiful in your book? And unfortunately, it's not in Portuguese, but we will translate some parts of it for the audience.
Um, well, I I think part of the argument that I make in the book is that, to be an effective giver requires a humility, a recognition that there isn't an easy formula, or a simple checklist to apply. That to the points that we've been discussing before, that it looks different in different contexts, but it certainly requires clarity of goals. That's the first thing, no matter what you're doing. So getting clear on what it is you're trying to achieve is important in anything in life. But it's harder in philanthropy because there's so many things you could do, so many pressing challenges, and everything seems related to everything else. And it often is,
Yes.
right? So like, I want to do something about education, but can I really do something about education without doing something about poverty? And you can see this even among the biggest donors in the world. Bill Gates, in the early days of his philanthropy, said, I'm only going to focus on global health. I'm not going to focus on global development. But over time, there was a recognition that, if you've got vaccines, but no roads, to get people to where they need to administer the vaccines, that's a problem, that these things are connected. So getting clear about goals is hard and really important. The second element of giving done right, I think, has to do with strategy. So what is the theory about how we will best achieve our goals as a donor? And here you could say, well, Phil, that sounds like just exactly what you'd need in any other walk of life. It sounds like what you need in business. And it is, except it plays out very differently. Like to my point before, where strategy in business is all about unique positioning and what is my competitive position, strategy in philanthropy is about shared strategy and recognizing that, you're not likely to be able to accomplish something by yourself. And that your strategies need to be informed by those who are closest to the problem. So a top-down approach doesn't work very well when we think we know best for others what they need. And, people who are experiencing challenges actually have great insight on those challenges, right? Like people are the best experts on their own lives. So having the humility to recognize the strategy that makes sense might already exist. It might be known by the people closest to the issues. And then that strategy needs to be iterative, that you're not going to get it right the first time. You're going to make mistakes and learn and have to shift. The third element just has to do with, and again, this sounds like what you would need in anything, but it plays out differently. Implementation, and the reason it plays out differently in the world of giving is that implementation has so much to do with this relationship between the donor and the nonprofit. And that's a really unique relationship because of the power dynamics. So one of the things that we do at Center for Effective Philanthropy is we do a lot of surveys of nonprofits to give feedback to foundations through something called the Grantee Perception Report. And people often say to me, oh, you do those customer surveys for foundations. And I'm like, no, they're not customer surveys. That's not a good analogy because the money is flowing in the opposite direction. And because of that, the power dynamics are completely different. So if you and I go out to a nice dinner and we have a terrible experience at a restaurant, we don't ever have to go there again. But if you or I are trying to raise money for our nonprofit from a donor that we know is one of only a few donors who might be able to support us in a big way, no matter how poorly we're treated, we're not going to go trash that donor on the internet, and because the power dynamics are just so different. And so that is really important to try to counteract, the fact that as a major donor, especially, you're not going to hear the unvarnished truth. You're going to be surrounded by people who want to tell you what they think you want to hear. So that makes it trickier, but there are ways to stay grounded and to get feedback. And then the fourth part, which we've discussed about discussed a bit already, is just about assessment and learning. So what are the things we will look at to see how we're doing? And those have to do with the end outcomes, the things that we want to see change for sure, but also sort of process indicators of our progress, along the way. And there we just have to be able to recognize that it may take a lot of time, and what might look like a failure in the near term might look like a success in the long term. And sometimes the opposite is true also. So it's tricky, but if you are paying attention, to the data, you can shift and you can change and you can improve on the basis of what you learn, and you can get better.
And Phil, Brazilians are known for their warmth and friendly behavior, but unfortunately, that doesn't really translate to the nations. According to the polls, we are not a so generous country when it comes to philanthropy, different from the USA. What can we learn from the American experience to promote the giving culture here? Can you give us some ideas?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things we're seeing in the United States, which is troubling, is a decline in the percentage of households that are giving. And I think there's a lot of explanations for that. But, it is true that traditionally we've had a strong culture of giving here. And I think that part of that is just rooted in the history of the country. Part of that is rooted in tax policy that, although it's quite flawed in various ways, it does encourage giving. And so I think I would be hesitant, to say the U.S. has it all figured out, or that you should do what we've done. Because I think there's lots of problems in this country, and just as there are in every country. Yeah. But I think building a culture of giving, building appreciation for the work of nonprofits, I feel like in our culture in the U.S., there's a tendency to be dismissive of nonprofits and nonprofit staff. There's a tendency to assume that,
too.
Yeah, like it's almost as if like, oh, you couldn't make it in the real world, so you work,
yes.
or you're just all heart and you're not that smart, and
yes.
These things are not
exactly.
true. These things are they're stereotypes, and they're not true. And I've seen some of the most, effective leaders in nonprofits and heroic staff and brilliant, innovative, creative people. Somehow, I think in Brazil, in the United States, around the world, we have to highlight those stories more. And I try to do that a little bit in the book. Who are these people who are coming in every day to work on an issue like, deep poverty, or like the gang-involved young people, like I talked about before. The people who are doing this work could do so many things, but they're called to do that work, and we should celebrate them, hold them up as the highly effective leaders that they are. I always say to people, and people will try to argue with me, and then they'll realize, oh, you're right. Leading a nonprofit takes everything it takes to lead an equivalent sized business and a ton more. It's harder. It's harder, not easier. And so if we do a better job in our cultures and societies of telling that story, and I think that started to happen a bit in the pandemic because people realized where folks were going. Yeah, exactly. That maybe that can start to shift people's habits and make giving just something that is done more widely and more significantly by those who are already doing it.
Couldn't agree more, Phil. And we are used to see people making points online, such as mentioned Elon Musk on Twitter saying that with a small fraction of his fortune, it will be possible to end hunger. And we saw that recently, and days after, the Tesla founder reply and say that if one could prove how they would use the money to end the hunger, he would sell his shares on the spot and make the donations. Having this in mind, I'd like to ask you two things. Do you think name dropping or public pleasure is really helpful when it comes to getting the attention of these very wealthy and unreachable billionaires, or goes on the other way? And do you think there's what these billionaires could and should be doing more for society?
Hmm. I mean, I think that billionaires, many of whom became wealthier, right, during the pandemic. If you think about someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, need to understand that people are absolutely going to be calling them out and asking them, what are they doing to better society? And I think that's appropriate. I think there's probably more and less effective ways to do it. But I think that if folks are accumulating that much wealth, there's responsibility that comes with it, and there's pressure that's going to come with it, and absolutely there's a moral responsibility to give back. And so I don't really have a problem, with people calling each other out on Twitter. I get called out on Twitter all the time, and I'm just a regular person. You got to have a little bit of a thick skin. And I think the important thing is, it's funny, we've had a lot of criticism recently, like of even the idea of philanthropy, right? Like there's a certain element of folks in this country who've been saying, oh, philanthropy just gets used by billionaires to buttress their reputations and, distract from the ways that they made their money or whatever.
It has become a power, né? Like the media is another way of power today. The big
Yeah.
philanthropists. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's truth to that, and we should be, asking questions about that. But also, once people have tremendous wealth, right? Like they have it, and we can talk about the way they should have been taxed at a higher rate, or the way we want to tax in the future, and we have to work that out in our elections. I certainly think in this country, the wealthy should be taxed at a higher rate. But now here we are, and they have the wealth that they have. I would like them to give as much of it away as possible, as effectively as possible. I would much rather they do that than buy, yet another yacht or yet another mansion. And so I
Or
think
go
that,
to Mars.
yeah, or exactly right. That's totally. So let's put pressure on folks, and let's also try to inspire them by saying, hey, look at what your peers have done. Look at the donors who are really working very effectively and making a difference, and don't you want to be like them, and hold that up as a positive example of what can be done with wealth. I think about people like Chuck Feeney, who founded Atlantic
Yes.
Philanthropies, right? And he's ending his life with almost nothing because he's given it all away and done really, really important work on all kinds of issues, from civil rights for gay, lesbian, bisexual people to issues related to being able to age with more dignity, all kinds of different challenges that he's worked on over the course of his life. And what an incredible thing that
Yes, he's
he wanted to
amazing.
give it all away while he was alive. And I wish more folks would look at that as the way to gain sort of notoriety and respect, as opposed to, like I said, or like you said, going to Mars or another mansion.
Sure. And Phil, how about you? Before our goodbyes, I would like to ask you a question I asked to our guest. What is your cause? What is the cause that makes your heart happy? And what were your last donation?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, there's so many causes that I have the same challenge that everybody does, right? Like how to figure out where to focus your giving, and in the pandemic, I ended up giving to organizations I had never given to before, right? Like a lot of us, and then I realized, but I want to keep giving to the ones I have been giving to. And so then you end up realize, okay, I'm just giving more. That's the only way around this issue. So I love some of the organizations that I mentioned in the book. So for example, I gave recently and give every year at least once to this organization that I refer to called UTech, which works with young people who are involved in gangs to get them out of gang life. And I just think they're incredibly effective, and that what they're doing is so important, not giving up on these young people, recognizing that people can make mistakes and they can still turn their lives around. I end up giving to organizations that I come across through my work, even if they're not in my, geography. So another organization I wrote about in the book that I give to every year is called Epiphany Community Health Outreach Services in Houston, Texas. And they're just an amazing resource to, the poorest of the poor people in the community that they're situated in, providing all kinds of support, including food, help signing up for government benefits that folks might not realize that they need. And, so anyway, I could go on and on. I think one of the issues that I have resolved to give more to in the future, because I feel like I haven't given enough, because I never quite know what to do, but I'm going to figure it out before the end of this year, is climate change. What are the best ways an individual donor can support organizations that are doing something about climate?
And do you have a monthly budget? How do you do?
We tend to do it at the end of the year,
Oh,
which I think is very common here, just because I'm not sure why exactly. It has to do with
it's about taxes.
taxes. It has to do with, that's when you're getting all the appeals, and so we kind of and then we kind of look at, well, what can we do this year? You have more of a sense of how things are going at the end of the
It's
year.
the giving season.
Good time to take stock. Yeah, exactly.
Starting with Giving Tuesday, we do that here too.
Yeah, exactly. No, Giving Tuesday is great. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's it. Thank you so much, Phil, for sharing your ideas and your knowledge, and sparing some time for us in your busy schedule. We really appreciate your presence, and hopefully we can meet someday soon in Brazil when
That
you
would be
visit
great.
us again.
That would be great. I'm so grateful for the invitation, and really fun to talk to you. And just appreciate being a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.